where instead of focusing on external world and all the broken systems, we focus on the inner world and empower people to change that. Our goal is to empower people to feel safe to love themselves courageously. This will probably be big for some people, but I've been on this evolution for the past number of years, and it's one that I firmly believe that we as a society need to go on. It's activism that focuses on healing yourself in order to heal the world. You know, it strikes me that we do not have a movement for humanity. We need all these other movements, but why don't we have something that encompasses all of us and goes to the root cause? We forget we all are on the same team, and even all these individual movements are working towards the same goal. We most definitely need human sustainability to take its rightful place alongside environmental and economic factors, and we don't have 25 years to wait. I mean, I really believe it's never been a more urgent than now to heal our society. There's a pandemic of self-doubt. You know, there's 1 in 2 people feel more self-doubt than self-love. There's an epidemic of loneliness. 1.2 million men ended their lives in the US, not because they were depressed, but because they were lonely. And we have an adolescent's mental health crisis. You know, we're forecasting that to be the #1 health condition by 2030. It's no secret that despite technology and globalization, we have never been more disconnected from each other, ourselves, and the planet. And I believe this type of approach is urgently needed, as it's what's bringing forward healing to save the planet. You know, we all long to belong. Thanks, Paul.
Wendy, thank you. A powerful point of view. I'm keen to come back and unpack that with you in a moment. Brad, but first let's turn to you. Welcome. We've heard the word regenerative already today, but tell us more about the Regenerative Change Lab, your work, and what do you believe is the most important thing for individuals to do to create sustainable and regenerative change?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I just want to start first with a land acknowledgement. I'm sitting here in Wabanaki territory, more specifically Penobscot land that we now call Portland, Maine. And I say that because everything I do is rooted in the wisdom of nature and the voices of our ancestors, of our indigenous brothers and sisters who are living in balance with living systems and life itself. And it's something that's come up today is how do we start to figure out how to drive the interchange, as James was talking about. The inner development goals is one approach, and regenerative leadership is another. They're intimately connected. But the work I do as co-founder of Regenerative Change Lab, which will also help you understand about what I believe is important for leadership today, is we work with change makers and leaders around the world to ground them in a clear understanding and perspective of where we are today, how we got here into this current, what we'll call a meta crisis, actually, which is more than a polycrisis being a confluence of many, many different crises and systems collapse. We've talked about that today. The data's there. But the meta crisis being a crisis of meaning. So we work with them to understand what is it that have brought us to today's ways of thinking and being and relating with each other in the world. And then we also like to help people, leaders, tune into and reconnect with their inner nature. So we have our inner nature and the outer nature that we see around us. We are all one. It's a unity. Help them navigate from their core and from their true, authentic selves, from their unique essence. And then finally, we also equip them with these life-affirming mindsets. So it's a mindset shift. And the skills to navigate change today, because change is happening all around us. Change is a constant, as we know. It's not about solving change or stopping change or running from change. It's about navigating through the change and the complexity with more confidence and courage into the unknown. We've never been here before. And to be active participants in the emergence and the co-creation of this regenerative future. It's nice to be able to think about what that might be, some sort of idyllic future, but it does exist for us here and now today. And so interestingly, about 10 years ago, I started this process of recognizing that leadership was really missing this inner development, this human development from the sustainability conversation, from conferences, from dialogue. I was continuing to see conference parties and even things like World Economic Forum, other gatherings of important leaders trying to make big decisions for the world that, they're walking away and with oftentimes limited results or very sort of self-interested results, and conflict. Um, and over the years, I've been developing that and researching it and building communities of practice. But this regenerative leadership really spoke to me because it comes from the heart of life. It spoke to me because it's a convergence and confluence of multiple disciplines, from systems thinking to cognitive behavioral sciences, to spirituality, to biomimicry. And it helps us address this crisis of meaning and start to have more hope today. So I just want to quickly talk about curiosity. What is the role of curiosity today? What is some of the dangers of curiosity? Interesting, that word crisis in Japanese as a symbol for both danger and opportunity. We know that. So what are the dangers and the opportunities? Some of the dangers that exist from curiosity, which really got us to where we are today, which have, again, helped us be who we are and where we are. But we had things like the dawn of agriculture and the rise of civilization and the exploitation and colonization of multiple peoples around the world. We had the scientific revolution and the industrial revolution. Now with AI, all these things have helped us get to where we are through our curiosity and wanting to understand life and how to be better and evolve. But they've also created some ways of thinking, like we've talked about earlier. It's nice to be last because then I can sort of refer to people, but this sort of linear thinking that we have, and this idea that we can control and manipulate nature and divide it up into extractable resources, and focusing really intensely on the atom, our atom-like thinking, which is the part and sometimes often missing the experience of the whole, understanding the whole system that exists. And how do we build things better and faster and cheaper and to mechanize everything? These are all curiosities that we've had that have also led to the challenges that we see today in this polycrisis, metacrisis situation. So what if we could start using curiosity in ways to not just feed our brains and our minds with more information and the ability to be right and the expert and everything, but really to open up our hearts and minds and our wills around other ways to navigate the change and challenges that we see today? What if we could use curiosity to expand the concept of who we are? Could we lean into VUCA, the volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity that exists all around us in nature? Those are natural characteristics of nature, not something to run from. Can we start to be curious about how do we shift away from dominance of our left brain, which is that highly analytical, logical, linear, factual side of our brains, to really opening up more our creative, intuitive, artistic, emotional, imaginative side, our right sides of our brains? Can we tap into other forms of intelligence? We often focus so exclusively on our brains and mind intelligence, and not so much on what's your intuitive intelligence and your heart intelligence, emotional intelligence. Obviously, these are things that have been talked about before, but how do we bring that and look at examples and metaphors from nature as the path forward? So that's just a little bit more about what I do, and I appreciate the time.
Brad, thank you. Okay, let's get into that. And I love how you both have described sort of stepping outside the system, and in some way sort of trying to create a collective meaning. And I want to click into two different topics to kick us off. One is about making choices, as Jameis talked about, but also Jonathan talked about there isn't the political will, and what is our ability to impact all of these different factors that essentially we are living within. If we talk about choices first, and I think you both talked about mindset. Being more sustainable, living a more sustainable life is often seen as a sacrifice. It's the harder choice to make. So what are some of the mindset shifts you've seen? And maybe do you have some examples that are necessary and things people can do to move away from sustainability as a sacrifice to one of opportunity and regeneration? Brad, maybe start with you.
Yeah, just making sure my mute is off. Yeah, thanks. So as I mentioned, that first thing that we do is just help people understand how we got here. I think a big part of moving away from this notion of sustainability as a sacrifice is to start to understand how we think today, how we've been trained and rewarded to think as we've moved up through organizations, and starting in school and class, early age. You're either right or wrong. Raise your hand, you're right. If you don't get it right, you're wrong. They're binary kinds of ways of thinking. And so in these linear ways of thinking and non-circularity. If you use living systems, I actually use and reference a lot my mentor, a guy named Giles Hutchins. He's from the UK. And his co-author, Laura Storm, they wrote Regenerative Leadership, and they have 7 principles of living systems. So starting to look at things like, how can we think about being more sensitive and responding to the changes that we're seeing, as opposed to trying to sort of command and control and save the planet. Even these words, language is so important to be thinking about as you're saying things, hit the ground running, bullet points, violence and colonialism and mechanistic extractive thinking is built into our language. So pay attention to that is one way to do that, and start to think about what are other ways about opening ourselves to other experiences and other ways of doing business and leading using living systems principles. And I could go into any of the 7. I'll just say them real quick. It's interesting. Life affirming, ever changing and responsive, relational and collaborative, synergistic and diverse, cyclical and rhythmical, flows of energy and matter, and the living systems field. And all of those have metaphors and teachings within them to apply.
Thanks, Brad. Wendy, same question to you. What are some of the mindset shifts, and what examples do you work with when you're trying to get people to move away from this idea of sustainability as sacrifice?
Yeah. I think one of the first things that really struck me was, if you were to think, Paul, at the beginning of your life, that you were given a human and you were told, Paul, your job is to look after you, the human. Most of us don't even believe that that's our job. We've come so far away from self, actually, and looking after self. In fact, we think it's selfish most of the time, the way that, we've been indoctrinated to believe. Like, first of all, like, we're looked after by parents if we're fortunate enough to have parents. And then we're looked after, we leave home, and then we're looking for somebody else to look after us, whether it's an organization or whether it's a partner. But we are our humans, right? We've got to look after ourselves. The only person that's going to look after you, Paul, is you, because nobody's coming to save us, right? We've got to save ourselves. And I really believe that, you are and we are each other. Paul, you're your custodian, right? And I suppose if you get up in the morning, you think, well, how am I going to look after me, my human? Yeah, we hardly ever think like that when we get up in the morning. We're usually too busy running around doing stuff. And so I think that answer, if you thought about yourself as you've got to look after you think about that answer differently. And, because there's so many times we allow ourselves to be, to be treated badly. We're in toxic relationships. It's completely different, though. If you looked after you as a human, you wouldn't be actually sacrificing yourself like that. And if you see, so I really believe that if you see yourself as a human and loving yourself, it's not actually a feeling to love yourself. I think it's an approach. And I really think it's a practice, because, by the way, it's not something that's easy to do. And you don't even need to like yourself at the beginning to do that. You just need to start practicing, like everything else, like going to yoga. You need to start practicing how to love yourself. And it's your job to love yourself. And I really believe that, our outward world really reflects our inward world. And until we actually do that as humans, and by the way, I've been doing this for a number of years, coming from the corporate world for 30 odd years. I don't believe that perspectives will change as speedily and as swiftly as we need.
Yeah, thanks, Wendy. And I want to sort of stay with you for a moment, because you mentioned earlier in your quite passionate opening about some of the work you've been doing with women and some of the societal changes we've seen there. And I want to ask then both of you, because this has come up in the conversations from the audience here, is where have you seen examples that have led to some kind of public outrage or citizen action that has actually empowered from an individual level right up to creating policy change or a societal change? And I am thinking of some of the changes that we've seen over the past, decades, let's say, in terms of how women are seen in the workplace and interact in society. So maybe, Wendy, you could talk about some of that moving from individual action through to collective action.
I mean, I think like a very famous one is when we got the vote as, as women, right? I mean, I actually did a talk not that long ago at Westminster, and I was in this fantastic room. And it turns out that that's where the suffragette movement started. And that was like women who would go to their husbands would be in Parliament, right? And they'd go and they'd pretend to be meeting for the church meeting, but yet they were becoming powerful as individuals and as a community together to enable things to change. And I think that's a very, very prevalent one to see. And I think as we as humans all come together, I do think there's a real movement that we can create as individuals. But I think particularly what's important as well is just looking at your own environment. I don't think you need millions of followers on YouTube and on Instagram, by the way. I think if you're really focused at locally in your environment, you can make huge changes. Even at my home, I've made huge changes. And to myself, I've made huge changes lately. So I think that, it's about really focusing in on what you can influence, actually.
What's in your span of control?
Yeah.
Brad, same question to you, and maybe like leaning into some of your work on sort of living systems and the systems thinking stuff. How do you go from individual action to more systemic change?
Yeah, thanks. I think I think one of the most important things here is to really pay attention to where the energy and desire and drive for change is coming from inside of yourself. One of the things that concerns me today is, while sort of, anger and, concerted action to, say it was mentioned a lot today is like, we need to act. And oftentimes I would stop and ask and say, are we acting in the right ways? Because if you're just rushing to act, you're oftentimes reacting. And that's not necessarily going to end up in a healthy, thriving result. So acting, thinking about the question, really, the bigger question, what's the question we're trying to solve? Are we even asking the right questions? And while that does take more time, and I know we many of us feel like we're running out of time, that's also something that is this need to sort of grasp and control and run from. But giving into the flow of this is going to sound a little out there, but giving into the flow of the universe and what are we being called to do right now in this great challenge and time of humanity, and coming from a grounded, centered place is going to answer your question, help us then as individuals come together as a collective, and also not just to come together as a collective in a powerful way, but also to address the opposing forces, the opposing challenging views in ways where we can actually come to some form of agreement, because it allows us to go into it with curiosity, to put ourselves in the shoes of the other people, even if we hate them and despise them and say, you guys, climate deniers and all this stuff, like, what are they trying to say? Where are they coming from? What's their worldview? Understand it, deep listening, compassion. And through that, all of change has happened in positive ways in our human history have come from, more appropriately, the successful ones have come from those spaces, not from anger and warfare, etc.
Thanks. One of the questions in the chat is about how we integrate this into our education systems, and I wonder if you've thought about this. And I'm sort of aware of some more recent things, like since the pandemic, more awareness about mental health, for example, and education around that. Currently, certainly in, let's say, the UK, other countries, obesity, how we are become more aware about the foods we eat and so on, seeing it as a problem for us individually, as we're talking about sustainability, not just something out there for somebody else to solve. What's your view on education and what needs to change when we're educating young people, but also people throughout their lives about sustainability? Wendy, should we start with you?
Yeah. I think one of the things that I have come to realize is that young people who are particularly struggling at the minute, certainly in the UK, and I do know it's a global thing, but let's just focus on the UK with adolescents, and I've had a personal experience of that. The evidence and research has shown that they are absolutely thrive when they are supported by amazing adults, right? So therefore, I think it's really important that we are educating even the people who care for these young people how to really get crystal clear about themselves, their own values, and then also to learn, as Brad just said, to trust their instinct again, that inner compass. Build genuine connection. I think that's the thing, being really connected to each other. And I've certainly seen that from my daughter's experience when she's been connected with an amazing group of teachers, parents, friends around her. And I think also setting proper boundaries, without feeling guilty. And I think therefore you're able to bring your whole self to school, work, and beyond. And that then helps others to do the same. And therefore feeling safe. I think one of the fundamental things is to feel safe, because how can people be who they cannot see? And I think it's a really true thing, right? They need to actually be able to see that from others. So I think it's a really important subject, that we do actually start really taking care of ourselves, to therefore take care of our communities, take care of our children, take care of our schools. And I think it's something that we can definitely bring into education systems.
Thanks, Wendy. Brad?
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I think most kids are, we are all born with this. Again, since we are one with nature, we're born with these capacities that we oftentimes have sort of learn how to ignore and repress, including our sensory capabilities and really knowing what the right thing is to do. Kids know what to do. They know the right things. I mean, depending on the age you're talking about, but I think we need to just figure out how to not try, to indoctrinate kids in the sort of old ways of thinking. Einstein says you can't solve problems using the old ways of thinking that created the challenge to begin with. Let's understand what those are first and foremost. Let's help our adults. I love what you said, Wendy. Let's help our adults and our teachers become the role models that they need to, and sort of do some of the unlearning and getting out of their own way. We use something called positive intelligence as a way to get out of the way of your saboteurs. We all have them, the judge and all these things that are constantly telling us we can't do things when we're small, and that gets in the way of our conversations and how we show up. So how do we help the teachers and the adults in society be adults? How do we help the kids really live into their full innate natural authenticity, and address the real mental health challenges that are out there? Helping them. There's a lot of that needs to be addressed.
Thank you. We've got about 30 seconds left in our panel. I'm going to ask each of you just to cast your mind forward and then straight back to the present day. What, in your most optimistic, most hopeful